Snow had been falling over Willow Creek since early morning. At first, it was only soft and gentle like white ash drifting over rooftops, old wooden fences, and the pine branches behind Walter Reed's house. But by afternoon, the sky had grown darker, the wind had risen from the mountains, and thick waves of snow began sweeping across the narrow road in front of his home. Walter stood by the kitchen window holding a warm cup of coffee in both hands. He was 75 years old. For most of his life, he had worked as a mail carrier in this mountain town in Montana. He knew every curve in the road, every old bridge, and every dirt path that disappeared beneath snow when winter came. But today something felt wrong. Near the fireplace, Max suddenly lifted his head. Max was a 6-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur and intelligent amber eyes. Around his neck was a small silver tag engraved with the words, "My best friend." Walter turned toward him. "What is it, Max?" Max did not bark. He only stared at the back door. Then Walter heard a tiny sound, weak, almost swallowed by the wind. A kitten's cry. Walter put down his coffee. Oh no. Max had already rushed to the door before Walter could put on his coat. When the door opened, snow and wind struck Walter's face. He pulled his wool hat lower and followed Max into the backyard. Max ran straight to the old woodshed. He lowered his head and pushed his nose into the snow beside the stacked firewood. Walter knelt and brushed the snow away with his thick gloves. Beneath the snow, inside a torn cardboard box, was a tiny orange kitten curled into itself. Its fur was soaked. Its small body trembled. Its eyes were barely open. Walter sighed softly. "Where did you come from, little one?" Max lowered his head and gently touched the kitten with his nose. The kitten gave a very weak cry, then pressed itself closer to Max's warmth. Walter carefully lifted it into his coat. "Come on, let's get you warm." But just as Walter turned back toward the sudden But just as Walter turned back toward the house, he was looking past the backyard fence, farther, toward the pine forest drowning in white snow. Walter narrowed his eyes and followed Max's gaze. At first, he saw nothing, only snow. Then a shape appeared between the trees. A dog, large, motionless. It was a husky. Its gray and white coat almost blended into the storm. Its blue eyes were cold but bright, fixed directly on Max. Around its neck was an old, dark collar with no visible name tag. Walter frowned. "Where did you come from?" The husky did not come closer. It looked at Max, then at the kitten inside Walter's coat. Then it turned and walked several steps into the forest. Stopped, looked back. Max stepped forward. Walter quickly said, "No, Max, we are not going into the woods right now." The husky barked once. Not violently, not threateningly. It sounded urgent. Then it disappeared into the snow. Max turned back to Walter, and Walter understood that look. He had seen it many times before, when Max warned him about a gas leak, when Max refused to let him climb a broken ladder, when Max pulled him away from thin ice near the creek behind the house. That was not curiosity. That was a warning. Walter looked down at the trembling kitten inside his coat. Then he looked back toward the forest. The husky appeared again a little farther away. It was still standing there, waiting. Walter whispered, "What are you trying to show us?" Max stepped into the snow, and even though every part of Walter's common sense told him to go back inside, Walter followed. Walter only meant to follow for a few steps. He told himself he would simply see what the husky wanted, then return home at once. The kitten was still trembling inside his coat. Max walked close beside him, occasionally lifting his head to check on Walter. But the forest changed quickly. After only a few minutes, Walter's small house disappeared behind the curtain of snow. The backyard fence was no longer visible. Even the footprints they had just made were nearly covered by the wind. The husky walked about 20 steps ahead. It did not run too far. Every now and then it stopped and looked back at Max and Walter, as if it knew Walter was old, as if it understood he could not move quickly. Walter held the kitten tightly inside his coat. "I don't know where you're leading us," he called over the wind, "but there had better be a reason." Max gave a soft whine. The husky suddenly stopped before a narrow trail between two rows of pine trees. Walter recognized this place. It was the old path leading down to the creek behind the forest. In summer, it was easy to walk, but in winter, snow covered everything, turning the ground and bushes into one endless white surface. The husky lowered its head and sniffed. Max did the same. Then, both dogs turned left, avoiding the main trail. Walter frowned. "We're not taking the trail." He took one more step forward. At that moment, the stick in his hand punched through the snow. Below it was a deep hole hidden under the white surface. Walter shivered. If he had taken 2 more steps, his foot could have fallen into it. Max immediately turned back and stood in front of Walter. The husky waited silently, a short distance away. Walter swallowed. "All right, I understand." For the first time, Walter realized that the most frightening thing about a blizzard was not the cold. It was the way it made danger invisible. A hole could look like a path. A creek could look like a snowfield. A rotten bridge could look like safe ground. And without these 2 dogs, he would have made a mistake within the first few minutes. Walter followed Max and the husky along the detour. The wind grew stronger. Snow struck his eyes, forcing him to squint. He could feel the kitten still breathing inside his coat, but its breath was very weak. "Hold on, little one," Walter whispered. "We'll get you somewhere warm." The husky suddenly picked up speed. Max followed for a few steps, then turned back to wait for Walter. Ahead through the wind, Walter heard another sound. Not a cat, not a dog. It was the creaking of wood. Walter stopped. Through the snow, he saw a small bridge crossing the creek. The bridge was covered in snow, smooth and white, looking solid and safe. But the husky did not step onto it. Neither did Max. Both dogs stood at the entrance, staring down at the white surface, as if they could see something beneath it that Walter could not. Walter moved closer and gently brushed the snow aside with his stick. A dark, rotten piece of wood appeared. Then a long crack. He brushed away more snow. His heart sank. The bridge was almost completely rotten. Many of the boards underneath had already broken, but snow had covered them so perfectly that the bridge looked whole. Walter stepped back. Dear God. At that exact moment, one of the middle planks dropped into the creek below. The dry crack echoed through the white forest. The kitten gave a weak, startled cry. Max immediately stood closer to Walter. The husky turned and began walking along the creek bank, as if it had known all along that the bridge could not be crossed. Walter looked at the husky, then at Max. "So, you know another way." The husky did not answer. It simply kept walking. And Max followed. Walter followed the 2 dogs along the creek. Beneath the thick ice, he could still hear the muffled sound of flowing water echoing through the silent forest. The farther they walked, the deeper the snow became. At times, it reached Walter's knees. Several times, he had to steady himself against old pine trees to keep from falling. Max stayed just behind him. Whenever Walter slipped, Max pressed gently against his leg, helping him regain his balance. Meanwhile, the husky continued leading from the front. Every so often, it glanced back, never impatient, never abandoning them. Walter began to realize something. The husky didn't just know the way, it knew how to guide others. About 20 minutes later, the sound of rushing water grew louder. Ahead of them lay a wide, white opening, a small mountain pond. During summer, it was only a peaceful pond hidden among the trees. Now it was completely frozen. Fresh snow covered the entire surface, making it impossible to tell where the shoreline ended and the ice began. Walter looked around. "If the ice is thick enough, we can cross here. Going around would cost valuable time." The sky was growing darker. He wasn't sure he had enough strength left. Walter took one step toward the frozen pond. Max gave a low growl. Walter stopped immediately. Max stared at the snow-covered ice. The husky walked over and scraped away a thin layer of snow with its paw. Clear ice appeared beneath, but across the surface, long spiderweb-like cracks spread beneath the ice. Walter drew in a sharp breath. The water is still moving, which meant the ice was nowhere near as solid as it appeared. Walter slowly stepped back. Just then, a full-grown deer burst from the trees. It was probably searching for a way out of the storm. Without hesitation, it leaped onto the frozen pond. 3 steps, crack. A sharp snapping sound echoed across the valley. The center of the ice collapsed. Dark water exploded upward through the opening. The deer struggled desperately. It tried to climb onto the edge of the ice, but every attempt shattered more frozen sheets beneath its weight. Walter stood frozen. If Max and the husky hadn't stopped him, he would have been the one trapped in that icy water. Max remained perfectly still. His ears stood high. His eyes never left the struggling deer. The husky lowered its head and let out a quiet whine. It knew it couldn't save the deer. Walter knew it too. The current beneath the ice was too powerful. If any of them stepped onto the ice now, they would all be lost. For a long moment, none of them moved. Eventually, the deer disappeared beneath the snow and freezing water. Walter lowered his head. "I'm sorry." The wind began to howl again. No one spoke another word. The husky turned away. This time, it avoided the shoreline completely. Instead, it led them along a narrow hillside covered with pine trees. The path was steeper, harder, but far safer. Walter watched the husky's footprints. He finally understood why Max had trusted this stranger so quickly. It wasn't blind instinct. It was trust earned through every correct decision. Nearly 30 minutes later, darkness had almost fallen. The wind suddenly shifted. Max stopped. The fur along his back stood up. He stared into the forest on their right. The husky froze as well. For the first time since they had met, Walter saw fear in its eyes. Not because of the path, but because something was watching them from within the storm. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. He tried to see through the swirling snow. A dark shadow moved silently between the trees, then disappeared. Max growled softly. The husky never looked away. Walter whispered, "We're not alone anymore." Walter stood perfectly still. He strained his eyes toward the forest where the shadow had disappeared. The wind howled through the old pine trees, sounding almost like whispers hidden inside the storm. Max stepped in front of Walter. His head was low. His ears were upright. His eyes never left the forest. The husky, however, stood several yards ahead. Unlike Max, it wasn't watching the shadow. Instead, it kept looking to the left, then forward again, as though searching for another route. Walter spoke softly. "Let's keep moving. We shouldn't stay here." None of them knew what had been watching them. Perhaps it was only a deer, perhaps a wolf, or perhaps nothing more than a trick of the blowing snow. Whatever it was, Walter had no intention of finding out. The husky started walking again. Max stayed close to Walter. The distance between the two dogs had become much shorter than when they first met. Every now and then, Max glanced at the husky. The husky returned the glance. Neither barked, neither growled. Yet somehow they were beginning to understand one another. About 10 minutes later, the sound of rushing water became louder. Walter frowned. The creek is ahead. He remembered this place well. To reach Willow Creek, they had to cross it. The old wooden bridge downstream had rotted away years ago. Walter had never expected to see another bridge out here. Suddenly, the husky turned right. It slipped through a line of snow-covered trees. Beyond them stood another bridge. Smaller, narrower, built from rounded logs. The strange thing was that Walter didn't remember this bridge at all. That's odd. He stepped closer. The entire bridge was buried beneath fresh snow. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a smooth white path. No railing was visible. No wooden planks could be seen. Only an unbroken blanket of snow stretching to the opposite bank. Walter was about to step onto it. Max barked sharply. Woof! Walter froze. Max ran ahead and stood directly in front of the bridge, blocking Walter's path. Walter frowned. What is it at that moment? The husky walked to the side of the bridge. It scraped away the snow with one powerful paw. Chunks of snow slid away. A dark wooden beam appeared beneath. It was cracked, almost completely rotten. Walter's heart skipped. He stepped closer and tapped it gently with his walking stick. Knock. The sound was hollow. He struck it harder. Crack. A rotten plank shattered instantly and plunged into the rushing creek below. The roar of icy water echoed through the valley. Walter quickly stepped back. If Max hadn't stopped him, he would already be in that freezing water. Walter gently stroked Max's head. "Thank you, boy." Max lowered his ears slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the broken bridge. Meanwhile, the husky had already begun walking along the creek. It showed no surprise. "As if it had always known the bridge could never be crossed," Walter murmured. "You've been here before, haven't you?" The husky didn't look back. It continued along the narrow creek bank. The path became tighter with every step. An icy cliff rose on one side. Dark rushing water flowed on the other. Walter had to grip exposed tree roots just to keep his balance. The wind grew stronger. Snow lashed against his face until he could barely keep his eyes open. Suddenly, the husky stopped. It stood upon a flat rock extending over the creek. Then it looked back at Max. Max immediately walked over. Both dogs stared into the rushing water. Walter carefully joined them. At first, he didn't understand. Then he saw it. Just beneath the flowing water, a natural line of large stones stretched across the creek. Normally, they would have been completely underwater, but winter had lowered the water level enough to reveal a narrow crossing. Walter smiled for the first time in hours. This is the real way across. The husky stepped onto the first stone. It tested every step before moving forward. Max didn't follow immediately. Instead, he remained beside Walter, waiting. Walter took a deep breath. All right, one step at a time. He placed one boot onto the first stone. The icy current rushed beneath him. One careless step, and the freezing water would carry him away. Max stayed close on his left. The husky waited on the far side. For the first time since entering the forest, Walter truly believed they might make it home. Walter had just stepped onto the final stone when a violent gust of wind swept across the creek. He bent low to keep his balance. Within seconds, the wind lifted the snow into towering white spirals. Everything disappeared. The creek, the pine trees, even the footprints behind them. Walter could barely see Max, though the dog was standing less than 2 yards away. "Max," he shouted. His voice was instantly torn apart by the wind. Max barked in reply. The bark sounded close, yet Walter couldn't tell where it came from. Just then, a gray and white figure burst through the swirling snow. It was the husky. Instead of running ahead, it turned back and stood directly in front of Walter. It barked once, short, firm, as if saying, "Don't move." Walter understood immediately. He froze. One arm still held the tiny kitten safely inside his coat. Max also stood perfectly still. 3 living souls formed a small circle in the middle of the blizzard. No one took another step. About 15 seconds later, the strongest wind passed. The wall of snow slowly began to thin. Walter let out a long breath. That was close. Before he could finish speaking, the husky turned toward the right and began sniffing the air. It walked a few steps, stopped, sniffed again. Max immediately joined it. Both dogs stared at the ground. Walter looked down as well, but he saw nothing except snow. Max began scraping gently with one paw. Snow peeled away in small layers. Beneath it stood an old wooden marker barely sticking above the ground. Walter froze. He remembered. It was an old trail marker leading back toward Willow Creek. Without uncovering it, no one would ever have known it was there. Walter smiled. Good boy. Max gave a small wag of his tail, but the husky still didn't move. Instead, it lifted its head toward the sky. Its ears twitched constantly. Walter looked up as well. The clouds had grown much darker. Heavy storm clouds rolled over the mountain ridge. He whispered, "The storm isn't over yet." Just then, a tiny cracking sound came from ahead. Walter didn't hear it, but both Max and the husky did. Their ears snapped upright. Both dogs rushed toward Walter. Max slammed his shoulder gently into Walter's leg. The husky grabbed the edge of Walter's coat and pulled him sideways. Walter lost his footing and fell into the snow. At almost the exact same moment, crash! A massive pine tree split in half and crashed down exactly where Walter had been standing. Snow exploded into the air. Huge branches buried themselves in the ground. Walter lay still for several seconds. His heart pounded wildly. 1 second later, and the tree would have crushed him. He slowly sat up and looked first at Max, then at the husky. Words failed him. He simply reached out with trembling hands and rested them gently on both dogs' heads. "You've saved me again." Max softly licked Walter's hand. The husky merely looked ahead toward the trail. It showed no pride, as though protecting Walter was simply the natural thing to do. Walter stood. He looked at the enormous fallen tree blocking the old path. Their only familiar route had disappeared. He gave a tired smile. "I guess the forest doesn't want us taking the easy road today." The husky turned, then quietly disappeared into a narrow passage between snow-covered rocks. Max looked back at Walter. Walter nodded. "Let's go. This time, I trust him." The narrow passage between the rocks was so tight that Walter had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Ice-covered cliffs rose on both sides. The wind was much weaker here. For the first time in nearly an hour, Walter could hear his own breathing. He looked down at the kitten inside his coat. It was no longer trembling violently. Max gently lowered his head and sniffed it. The kitten rubbed its tiny face against Max's warm nose before curling up to sleep again. Walter smiled. "At least you're all right." About 15 minutes later, the faint smell of burning wood drifted through the air. Walter stopped immediately. Smoke, he inhaled again. There was no mistake. It was the scent of firewood. But in the middle of a blizzard, who could possibly be out here? The husky smelled it too. It looked toward Max. Then both dogs picked up their pace. Walter hurried after them. A few hundred yards later, the pine trees began to thin. In a small clearing stood an old cabin. Its roof was buried beneath snow. The chimney leaned to one side. The windows were boarded shut. There was no light, no fresh footprints. Walter walked closer. He placed a hand on the wooden door, ice cold. He pushed gently. Creak. The door slowly opened. A wave of freezing air and the smell of old timber drifted outside. Dust covered everything. The fireplace had long gone cold. A wooden chair lay overturned near the wall. An old blanket hung beneath layers of cobwebs. Walter slowly shook his head. No one's here. Max began carefully sniffing every corner of the room. Meanwhile, the husky stood motionless in front of the fireplace. It didn't sniff. It didn't move. It simply stared. Walter felt something strange, almost as if the husky had been here before. He walked closer. Inside the cold ashes were several half-burned logs. Walter gently stirred them with his walking stick. The lower layer of ash was still dry. He frowned. This place hasn't been abandoned for very long. He looked around. Deep claw marks scarred one section of the wooden wall, not knife marks. Animal claws. Near the corner lay several strands of gray and white fur. Walter picked one up. He turned toward the husky. The fur matched perfectly. Before Walter could speak, Max barked loudly. Woof! He stood beside an old wooden cabinet, scratching the floor insistently. Walter pulled the cabinet aside. A small trap door appeared beneath it. He slowly opened it. A cold draft rose from below. Walter switched on the small flashlight in his pocket and shined it into the darkness. It was only a storage cellar. Several wooden crates, old tools, and a stainless steel dog bowl. Walter climbed down carefully. He picked up the bowl. Beside it lay an old leather collar. No name, no address. But the size was perfect for the husky. Walter looked up. The husky was standing quietly at the top of the stairs. Its blue eyes no longer looked cautious. Instead, they seemed filled with memories. Walter whispered, "Was this your home?" The husky didn't bark. It slowly walked down into the cellar, stopped beside the old collar, sniffed it gently, then lay down beside it. Walter felt a heaviness in his chest, perhaps before meeting Max. Before leading Walter through the blizzard, this husky had once had a family of its own, a place to belong, a home. Now, only this lonely cabin remained. Just then, a soft sound came from outside. Knock, knock. Walter looked up instantly. Max spun toward the door. Both ears stood straight. Silence filled the cabin. Then, another sound. Closer this time. Knock. It wasn't someone knocking on the door. It sounded as though something was walking across the snow-covered roof. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. Max stepped in front of him. The husky raced back up the stairs and stood at the entrance. Every hair on its body stood on end. The air inside the cabin suddenly became heavy. Walter held his breath. Outside, whatever it was, had just stopped directly above the roof. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. The cabin had become so silent that he could hear his own heartbeat. Knock. The sound came again. This time, it wasn't just one knock. It came in a series. Knock, knock, crack. Tiny grains of snow drifted through the gaps in the wooden ceiling. Walter looked up. That's strange. Max let out a low growl. Walter had never seen him this tense. Even the husky kept backing toward the doorway, not out of fear, but as if urging Walter to leave. Before Walter could react, the husky gently grabbed the edge of his coat. It pulled. You want me outside? The husky pulled harder. Max rushed to the door, then turned back, barking loudly. Woof, woof. Walter didn't understand, but he trusted Max. Holding the kitten tightly inside his coat, he followed the two dogs outside. They had barely moved 5 yards away. Boom! A deafening roar exploded from the mountainside behind them. Walter spun around. An entire wall of snow was collapsing. Not the roof, an avalanche. Hundreds of tons of snow-broken trees and rocks thundered down the slope like a white tidal wave. Within seconds, the cabin disappeared completely. Buried beneath several feet of snow, Walter stood frozen. 10 seconds later, and all 4 of them would have been trapped inside forever. He slowly turned toward the husky. You knew this was coming. The husky never looked at him. Its eyes remained fixed on the mountainside. Only then did Walter notice the enormous shelves of snow still hanging from the pine trees above. The first avalanche might not be the last. Run, Walter shouted. No one hesitated. Max stayed beside Walter. The husky led the way. Behind them, the mountain continued to roar. Clouds of snow chased them downhill. The ground shook beneath Walter's boots. He tried to run, but age slowed him. Then, he slipped. Walter rolled down the snowy slope. His walking stick flew from his hand. The kitten cried out in panic. He reached desperately for anything to stop himself. Ahead stood a massive pine tree. At this speed, hitting it could break every bone in his body. Max sprinted after him. Within seconds, he caught up. He threw his body sideways against Walter's shoulder. Both of them slid several more yards before stopping inches from the tree. Walter lay there gasping. Max panted beside him, his black and tan coat covered in snow. Walter wrapped both arms around Max's neck. Thank you. Just then, the husky barked sharply from above. Walter looked up. A huge boulder had broken loose from the avalanche. It was rolling directly toward them. Walter hadn't even stood up yet. The husky charged downhill without hesitation. It slammed its shoulder into Max. Max instantly understood. Together, the two dogs pulled Walter sideways. Crash! The boulder smashed into the exact spot where Walter had been lying. Stone exploded in every direction. Walter stared at the dogs. One had saved him for the 3rd time, the other for the 4th. He smiled weakly. I think, today I'm the one being led home. Behind them, the cabin was gone. Ahead, the storm still raged. But Walter no longer felt lost, because every time he looked down, he could see 2 sets of footprints leading the way. One belonged to Max, the other to the husky. And as long as those footprints remained ahead of him, he knew he would never give up. Walter slowed his pace. After surviving the avalanche, all 3 of them were exhausted. The wind had weakened, but the cold seemed even harsher than before. He brushed the snow from Max's back. Are you hurt, boy? Max gave himself a quick shake. Aside from a few small scratches on his front leg, he seemed fine. Walter smiled with relief. Then he turned toward the husky. The dog stood several yards away. It never cried out in pain. But now Walter noticed that it was limping slightly on its left hind leg. Walter walked toward it. "Come here." The husky instinctively stepped back. Its blue eyes remained cautious. Walter stopped. He slowly sat down in the snow, placed his walking stick beside him, then stretched out one hand. "It's all right." Max looked at the husky. He gently walked over and touched noses with it, as if saying he won't hurt you. After a long moment, the husky finally stepped forward. Walter carefully lifted its paw. A sharp wooden splinter was lodged deep in the pad, probably from the rotten bridge they had crossed earlier. Walter sighed softly. So that's what it was. He took out the small pocket knife he always carried. Very carefully, he removed the splinter. The husky flinched, but it never snapped, never growled. It simply looked into Walter's eyes. Walter wrapped the injured paw with his wool scarf. It should hurt less now. The husky sniffed the bandage, then looked at Walter for a long moment. It was the first time its eyes no longer seemed guarded. Instead, they carried something that looked very much like gratitude. Max gently wagged his tail. Walter smiled. "I guess we're a real team now." They continued their journey. The sky slowly darkened. Snow was still falling, but much more lightly. Every now and then, Walter could see distant mountain peaks. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. After nearly 30 minutes, the husky suddenly stopped. It lifted its head and sniffed the air. Max did the same. Both dogs stared in the same direction. Before Walter could ask why, the husky changed course. Instead of following the trail, it began climbing a rocky hillside. The climb was difficult. Walter breathed heavily. "The valley path looks much easier." He pointed toward the wide, snow-covered flat below. It looked like a perfect shortcut. The husky ignored it. Max followed without hesitation. Walter sighed. "All right, if both of you choose this way, then so will I." 10 minutes later, they reached the hillside. Walter glanced down into the valley. His heart nearly stopped. The smooth white field below wasn't solid ground at all. It was a massive snow bridge covering a deep mountain chasm. Beneath it, there was only darkness. If they had taken the easier path, one wrong step, and all of them would have disappeared into the abyss. Walter stood speechless. He turned toward the husky. You knew it wasn't safe." The husky simply stared into the valley. Perhaps it had seen something terrible happen there long ago. Perhaps that was why it always avoided the easiest-looking path. Walter gently rested his hand on the husky's head. "I won't doubt you again." The husky quietly closed its eyes. Then it continued walking. The sun had completely disappeared. Only a faint orange glow remained along the horizon. Walter's worry returned. When darkness falls, we won't be able to see the trail. At that moment, Max's ears shot upright. He looked behind him. The husky turned as well. Both dogs froze. Walter slowly looked back. Far away through the falling snow, small pairs of glowing eyes reflected the fading light. One pair, then two, then three. No, many more. They didn't come closer. They simply followed, keeping their distance. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. His voice became little more than a whisper. "This time, I think they're really wolves." Walter stood perfectly still. He could no longer count how many pairs of glowing eyes were following them. The last light of evening reflected briefly in pale yellow eyes before disappearing behind the falling snow. No howls, no growls, only silence. A silence far more frightening than any sound. Walter swallowed. He had spent nearly his entire life in Montana. He knew wolves well. They rarely attacked people, especially people who were still standing strong. But harsh winters changed everything. If the pack had gone hungry for days, there were no guarantees. Max stepped in front of Walter. His shoulders lowered, his head remained still. His eyes never left the darkness. On the opposite side, the husky slowly moved into position, without a word, without a signal. The two dogs naturally formed a protective line around Walter, one on the left, one on the right. Walter looked at them both. He smiled faintly. No matter what happens, we're going home together. The wolves still didn't approach. They simply walked alongside from a distance, keeping roughly 50 yards between them. Walter noticed. They're waiting. Waiting for what? The answer came quickly. They weren't waiting for him. They were waiting for him to become exhausted, to fall, to make one mistake. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. Don't give them the chance. The trail sloped downward. A steep cliff rose on the right. A dense pine forest covered the left. There was no other way forward. Then, the husky suddenly stopped. It lifted its head, took a deep breath, then looked toward Max. Max immediately understood. He trotted several yards ahead, sniffing carefully. Walter followed. Only a few steps later, he understood. A narrow chasm blocked the trail, barely 6 feet wide, but so deep that its bottom vanished into darkness. An old pine tree had fallen across it years ago. Its trunk was covered with snow. It looked like a natural bridge. Walter looked down. His legs trembled. If I slip, he couldn't finish the sentence. The husky stepped onto the trunk first, very slowly, testing every step. When it reached the other side, it turned and waited. Max didn't cross. He stayed beside Walter. Waiting for him, Walter drew a deep breath, one step at a time. He stepped onto the trunk. The wind roared through the chasm below. Walter forced himself not to look down. One step, then another. Suddenly, a powerful gust slammed into him. The trunk shifted slightly. Walter lost his balance. Max, without hesitation, Max leaped onto the log. He stood directly in front of Walter. He never turned around. He simply remained still. Walter instinctively rested one hand on Max's back to steady himself. Step by step, a man and his dog slowly crossed together. On the opposite side, the husky waited, never moving. When Walter finally stepped safely onto solid ground, he collapsed into the snow. Breathing hard, we made it. At that exact moment, crack. The old pine trunk snapped in half behind them. It plunged into the darkness below. Walter spun around. Just a few seconds later, and none of them would have survived. Walter looked at Max, then at the husky. He said nothing. He simply wrapped both arms around them. For the first time, the husky didn't pull away. It allowed Walter to hold it. In that moment, Walter knew the husky was no longer a stranger. It had become family. But the peace lasted only seconds. From the far side of the chasm, a long howl echoed through the night. Ah-woo, then another, and another. Walter slowly turned. The wolf pack had reached the edge of the ravine. The distance between them was now less than 30 yards. The alpha wolf stepped forward. It looked at Walter, then at Max. Finally, it locked eyes with the husky. The husky stared back. No growl, no fear, only quiet determination as it stood shoulder to shoulder with Max. Two dogs, standing together, facing an entire pack of wolves beneath the winter sky. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick. He knew their journey was not over yet. The long howl slowly faded into silence. The wolf pack remained on the opposite side of the chasm. The alpha wolf stepped closer to the edge before stopping. It stared into the darkness where the fallen tree had disappeared. The gap between the two sides was only a few feet wide, yet now it had become a natural wall. Walter refused to let his guard down. He knew the wolves might find another route. They could circle around, or continue following them from a distance. Max never took his eyes off the pack. Meanwhile, the husky turned toward the trail ahead. It barked once, quiet, but firm, as if saying, "We have to keep moving." Walter nodded. "All right, and thank you for not letting me give up." They continued along the mountainside. Night had fully fallen. The pale moon was hidden behind thick snow clouds. Only a silver glow covered the forest. Walter's pace became slower and slower. Every breath felt heavier. His legs were growing numb with exhaustion. He knew he was reaching his limit. Then, Max suddenly ran ahead. He stopped on top of a large rock. His tail wagged excitedly. Walter climbed after him. "What is it?" When he reached the top, he stopped in amazement. Far below the mountain, a ribbon of warm, yellow lights stretched across the darkness. Not moonlight, not stars, lights. Walter narrowed his eyes. Then he smiled. Willow Creek. He recognized it instantly. Porch lights, street lamps, windows glowing warmly in the distance. They had been heading the right way all along. Max barked loudly. It was the happiest bark Walter had heard all day. Walter knelt and hugged him. "We're almost home." Behind them, the husky remained still. It wasn't looking at the town. It was looking back toward the forest, as if making certain nothing else was following them. The descent was difficult. Many sections were covered with ice. Walter had to grip frozen bushes to keep from slipping. Max stayed below him, ready to catch him if he fell. The husky continued leading the way. About 30 minutes later, they reached the first wooden fence. Then an old mailbox buried in snow. Then, the familiar dirt road leading into Willow Creek. Walter could hardly believe his eyes were really home. Just then, a pickup truck rolled slowly along the snowy road. Its headlights swept across them. The driver slammed on the brakes. The door flew open. A middle-aged man climbed out. Walter looked closely, then smiled. Tom. It was Tom Harris, his neighbor from just a few streets away. Tom hurried over. "My goodness, the whole town has been looking for you." Walter smiled wearily. "I just wandered a little farther than I planned." Tom looked at Max, then at the husky, finally at the tiny kitten peeking out from Walter's coat. He was so surprised he didn't know which question to ask first. Walter simply smiled. "It's a very long story." Tom opened the truck door. "Come on, let's get you home." Walter took a few steps before turning around. The husky was still standing at the edge of the road. It didn't move. Walter called softly, "Come here." The husky looked at Walter, then back toward the forest. For a long moment, it stood between two worlds. Finally, it slowly walked toward him. Max happily trotted over and gently touched noses with the husky. Walter smiled. "That's right. From today on, you won't have to walk alone anymore."